Welcome again, everybody, to IHMA Research Seminar's last session of the year. So today we have with us, we're honored by the presence of Olivia Mandy O'Neill from George Mason University. Before I get her to share her research and insights with us, I'd like to give a brief introduction of her. And Olivia is, I think she likes to be called Mandy, so I'll go with Mandy. Mandy is an associate professor of management at the George Mason University, Costello College of Business, and she's also a senior scientist at the university's Center for the Advancement of Well-being. She holds a doctorate degree in organizational behavior from Stanford University, and she was also a National Science Foundation graduate fellow. She has a portfolio of award-winning work on emotional culture and careers that has been published in top journals and practitioner outlets like Administrative Science Quarterly, Academy of Management Journal, and Harvard Business Review, among many, many others. And today we are very excited by Mandy sharing her research with us that specifically focuses on the emotional culture of companionate love in organizations, what helps, what hurts, and why it matters. This will be a presentation that synthesizes a decade of applied research on the emotional culture of companionate love, and it will explore a constellation of workplace assumptions, values, norms, artifacts, and its implications for employee attitudes, team function, and organizational effectiveness broadly. I won't go so much into detail, but this is going to be a comprehensive research presentation. We'll learn a lot, and hopefully, Mandy, we can also contribute to some extent to your research with our questions and discussions. And with that, I leave it to Mandy to continue with her presentation. Thank you for being with us today again.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you everyone for being here today. It's at least in the US, it's in between lots of holidays, so lots of things to do at this time of year. So thank you for sharing this lunch hour in the East Coast anyway with me. And I'll jump into some of this work, which has been the the work I've been most excited about for many years, including before we finally managed to get it through the academic journals, when we were hearing a lot of skepticism, especially from businesses, but just people who didn't believe that we could use the term love at work. And even if they did, they would sometimes have to disguise themselves and come to conferences to hear about the work and related work on compassion. And they would have to tell their bosses that they were coming to a leadership conference, because it was, even practitioners were nervous to come and learn more about it and how it might impact their work. So I'll present a decade of trials and tribulations and triumphs and some of the work that's gotten out there in the next half an hour, and leave time for questions and ideas, because one of the reasons I love doing these talks, among other things, is that usually, especially those of you in the practitioner world, and maybe just to test out our, I am an emotion scholar, so to test out our use of the reactions, maybe raise your hand in the session. If you raise your virtual hand, if you're coming from the practitioner world. Do we have any little hands raised? I'm looking on my other screen to see any little hands. We're all scholars? All right, let's see if we're working, or if you can hear me. Any scholars? Raise your virtual hands. Okay, all right. I saw some movement. Okay. All right, there we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. And maybe we have some scholar practitioners, so people who live in both worlds, which I do. And that's the only way I could do this work, is with the help of my partner organizations who are willing to let me come in and learn what's there, and also help make changes for the better. So with that, I'll start. I'll go way back to where this work began, which some of you may recognize as Stanford University, my alma mater. I came there as a graduate student, and I was intending to study organizational culture, where there are many experts. And pretty much as soon as I got on campus, but really in my dorm room, I discovered that I couldn't understand people at all. And this was my own home country, but the United States is a big place. So I went out there and I realized that I couldn't I couldn't understand what people were giving off to me. Were they mad at me? Were they happy? Were they sad? From an East Coast, Mid-Atlantic perspective, it seemed like everybody was just chill all the time, and a lot was going on under the surface. I soon learned. But I came from the Mid-Atlantic where people, you didn't need to use your emotion words. You could just see it on people's faces. I saw this last year. Anger has a face, and it's the Screamies Yankees fan. Because yeah, I mean, people in the Mid-Atlantic where I grew up, they just express themselves in every modality, non-verbally, verbally. So to go to a place where I couldn't read people's emotions was a curiosity of mine that actually began this work that I'll talk about today. So immediately I started to think that organizational culture, the way we had been talking about it, was missing something, and in particular, it was missing the emotional part of culture. So, in part, with the information I was learning from my new travels to the West Coast, where there was a different set of emotion expression norms that were kind of impacting how people interact with one another, I started to think about organizational culture in a different way, which had to do with emotions. So, along the way, I pitched the idea to my advisor, Charles O'Reilly, who said he wasn't interested in emotions. He didn't think they mattered. He's still, I think he's finally come around to the emotions matter, but he suggested that I call a former student of his, Sigal Barsaid, because she was kind of into emotions. She was at Yale at the time, transitioning to University of Pennsylvania. So together, as a PhD student, Sigal and I began a program of work, which we called emotional culture. And one of the things I learned about academia and about the world, the rest of the world, is that no one reads anything in academic journals unless they're an academic and usually a PhD student, but they do read Harvard Business Review. So the only thing I think my parents have ever read and may ever read was when Sigal and I published an article in Harvard Business Review called Manage Your Emotional Culture, which actually came out after at that point, 6 to 8 years worth of work in an organization that had what we came to discover was a very strong culture of companionate love. But, before we even got to that point, we had to make the case that organizational culture could be conceptualized in a different way, not the iceberg metaphor that many of you have seen, which has a variety of problems, but as more of a living metaphor where rather than assuming that only what you see on the surface is superficial, what if we really, completely transform that to where the emotional expressions that you are, picking up from people, including non-consciously, really mattered importantly, and that when you enter nowadays, a lot of us are on Zoom, but in some ways those emotional expressions matter more than ever because you spend your faculty meetings or your team meetings looking at each other's faces and trying to figure out what people are feeling or what are they laughing at if they're not laughing at the meeting. I mean, what's going on? So I think if anything, it's just gotten more important. But we essentially wanted to suggest that if we rethought about culture differently, we could think about it more as a different metaphor. That's the little flower or plant metaphor, which I sometimes use instead of the iceberg. And specifically, we could think about it in terms of one emotion that is so central to humanity that no one except maybe business schools would think it doesn't matter. Because frankly, the context we were studying at healthcare had been integrating caring and compassion, frankly, because it was part of its mission since the origin of medicine and specifically nursing, but all fields of healthcare. But oddly, businesses were a little slow to pick that up. In fact, we had one reviewer who said, I just don't think workplace relationships can be strong enough or close enough to be what you called love. And the great thing about science is that this is not, it's not about believing in Santa, it's about believing in science. So Sigal and I came up with a series of studies, particularly in a long-term care context, that invited us in. And what we demonstrated is that, in fact, workplace relationships could be strong enough to be called love and that it mattered. Now, first, though, what do we mean by love? Love is a kind of an interesting emotion because it's not romantic love. So Valentine's Day, journalists will sometimes call and ask for a quote. And I have to say, well, it's not that kind of love. It's this other kind of love, affection, caring, compassion, tenderness, fondness, which again has been studied for decades, mostly in psychology, but business had really not either thought it was appropriate or not thought it was important enough, or that it didn't impact the bottom line. And so, for the most part, had neglected it. Although, interestingly, I will say, at least in the US, California had been one of the regions of the country where this work, especially in the early kind of 2010s, when we were first presenting and getting this work out there, that region was one of the most receptive. I think they were a lot more influenced by what some people call these woo-woo influences, including some of these emotions, than some other parts of the country and the world. I can definitely say that in presenting this work around the world, I've gotten very different reactions from certain countries, which I'll share a little bit about that later, because I think that's some of the most fun. So what is this culture of compassionate love? Some people say companionate love is what we call it. I want to start with this little image, because in one of the interviews I had done very early on, a supervisor told me that companionate love to her was when one of her subordinates knew she was going through a tough time and brought her Tylenol and tea. And she thought that was such a thoughtful, caring gesture. And I like that example because just last year at my conference, I lost my voice and I was like, oh no, I have to give a presentation. And without even knowing that story, one of my junior collaborators, Jacob Levitt, who's now an assistant professor at Indiana University, brought me, he didn't bring me Tylenol, but he brought me some sort of throat drop that like sort of, like freezes your throat so you can't feel the pain. And I was so touched because it reminded me of that gesture that I'd heard about when we were first getting very descriptive examples of what culture of compassionate or companionate love looks like. So what Sigal and I were able to demonstrate in this long-term care setting is that all of these words were impacting what we call the culture of companionate love. And I'll just point out a couple of highlights here. One is that it's not just caring for patients, for example, which is very common in healthcare. This was really about staff taking care and caretaking and expressing care and compassion to one another, not just down the hierarchy from leaders to followers, but, in the example I gave, subordinates taking care of their supervisors, team members taking care of each other. So laterally up and down throughout the organization, not just one department, not just after one incident that was painful, but over time. And really up and down the levels of culture, as Ed Schein and others have talked about it. So not just in terms of, the superficial, he would say, or I would say the level of artifacts, but also the deeply held assumptions, the taken for granted, the values and priorities, the norms, the rituals, all of that is what we mean by culture. And in fact, all of that is what we use to present evidence or to at least do analysis of what the culture is one way or the other. It works in two ways. It works in part because people deeply feel the emotions, but what we demonstrated is that it also works if you don't even feel it, but you just enact it. Now, in later work, we're unpacking what are the consequences of insincerity, particularly with some other emotions like gratitude. But at least in the case of love, honestly, people really did respond to caretaking gestures, even if internally the person was sort of feeling like, oh no, you having to take off work to take care of yourself means I'm going to have more work. Even if they were kind of regulating that, sort of anxiety, to express compassion or caring outwardly really mattered to the other person. So we were demonstrating that it happens through many different pathways. And then on the right-hand side, what we demonstrated is it mattered for, at least in this case, the organization's bottom line, which included employee outcomes, emotional exhaustion, absenteeism, teamwork was demonstrably higher. We saw some evidence of improvements in patient outcomes. Now, mind you, this wasn't taking care of the patient. This was when the staff take care of each other. The patients benefited, particularly in terms of quality of life and some of the, sort of wellness indicators. We didn't find as strong evidence of health, but for anyone who works in healthcare, there's a lot going on that has nothing to do with the culture of the staff that can't be helped, although we did see some evidence. But then interestingly, what we also saw is that it rippled out to the family members of the patient. So how the staff were with one another actually had this ripple out effect to the families, which is so, to us, that was just so compelling. Because imagine, for example, you work at a bank. It would be your customers knowing nothing about how you are at headquarters or how you are behind scenes, saying, I'd be more likely to take out a loan with this mortgage company, or I'd be more likely to invest my money based on how the staff took care of each other. So kind of take that out to whichever industry and think about the implications of that. In higher education, it'd be like our students' families saying, I'd be more likely to send my child to your school because the faculty and staff took care of one another. So that's to us, that was some of the most exciting uh, findings. But of course, in the review process and as science works, you start getting questions. So one of the first set of questions we got was, okay, fine, O'Neill, I believe love matters, but is this just like a woman thing? Because, women are more compassionate, and maybe that's just in industries like healthcare where there are a lot of women. Well, that's a good question. So for the next study, my collaborator Nancy Rothbard and I went into what I concluded, and I really had to prove, was one of the most masculine occupations that at the time I could get my hands on, which was firefighting. So this was like 99% men, very heroic, very masculine. And what I discovered on this table, where you can't read most of these words, maybe you can, was that similar to the previous context, love was evident in the culture of these firefighting units all the way from top to bottom. So the physical enactments on down to the deep underlying assumptions. So we found evidence of that. So in fact, love matters in masculine organizations or male-dominated organizations also. We also found that it impacted performance in a way we hadn't seen before, although interestingly, it wasn't love so much. It was another emotion, joviality, which was, humor and amusement and pranks and teasing and good times that mattered more, and not always in a good way. But so we started to think about, well, there may be some other things going on besides just love. So love is not alone, but it did matter, especially when it came to well-being, work-family conflict, health, stress, and that sort of thing. So that study made us realize, is love all you need, to use another pun that I've used in my articles? The answer is no, it's not. Usually love is paired with other emotions in the culture. And in this case, we were starting to see that, the example of love and joviality is an illustrative one, because in some organizations, when the joviality, like in some of these firefighting units, when the joviality was so extreme, it was like the craziest frat house or animal house, or the sort of places where accidents and injuries and unnecessary risk taking takes place, but also kind of like mean humor sometimes, because they lacked the sensitivity that some of the other units had to be able to say, hey, let's not joke about that with this person. That really hits close to home, or they're going through a tough time. Let's lay off on them a bit. That's what you saw when they had units that were defined by both love and joviality, which is the top right side. That's George Mason women's basketball last year. And, my employer, we really are hoping that we can have another Final Four basketball team, because, if you look at any sports teams, you'll see a lot of love and a lot of joviality, and it tends to be very successful in winning. But, the off diagonals also made us question, well, what happens when, there's too much love, or, maybe love is not paired with an emotion that may be useful. And what happens when there's just no love? Is it hate, or is it something else? So that made us start to think about this in a more complex way. And I'll give you a preview of what's coming up, which is that in some of the extremely high cultures of love, we saw, for example, pockets of cliques, for example, some really close people, some really not close people, and that didn't work out so well. Another image I've used in that particular cell is a couch potato, because sometimes in the firefighting units, we would see people who were really, really chill and loving and caring, but lacked a little bit of the fire in the belly that you need as a firefighter to be on your toes. And so there are some other emotions that are really helpful for that. Joviality is one, anxiety is actually one. And so in other research, Sigal and I and our collaborator, Francesco Seguro, found that actually love and anxiety are a quite powerful combination, particularly when you need to be vigilant, when you need to be on your toes, But without the love, in that case, the anxiety can be quite problematic. The interesting one that everyone wants to ask about is like the opposite of love. And, they say, well, is it anger? Well, no, actually, Elie Wiesel once said the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And that's really what we find is that sometimes there is another emotion like anger, but that's not the opposite of love. The opposite of love is really indifference. So it's sort of, it could be coldness, it could be professional neutrality, but it's just the absence of that caring and compassion. Okay, so sometimes it also looks sort of interesting in ways that we don't recognize. So there's that famous scene last year, Travis Kelce kind of yelling at his manager, and people were wondering what he was saying, and he was saying, "Well, no, I love that guy." I mean, so you do see it in all sorts of industries. It doesn't always look the same in every industry. So in nurses, it might look one way. In football players, it might look another way. In investment bankers, it might look a different way. And what I'm excited to share is some new research on a completely different industry, which is not like any of the others, because of course people started to say, well, is this just life or death industries? I mean, okay, fine, it's male dominated, sometimes it's female dominated, but they're all life or death. What about industries where it's just the spreadsheets or the numbers or innovation or competition or making money in the stock market? And so for me, that was another challenge to really say, well, yeah, what does it look like in industries where you might not expect it? Maybe it can't exist because the pressures of the performance nature or the business that they're in mean there's no place for it, or love is weakness, and might be culled out because there are workers who are going to work longer, harder, smarter, and those are the types we want. So for that, we went to, and again, this actually came up in a talk not dissimilar from this. This was the conference where there was a vice president of a semiconductor industry lurking in the audience who had said he was going to a leadership conference, but really was kind of into this and thought they needed more of it in the semiconductor industry, which I can say they do. So for me, this was perfect because this was like the extreme. It's like, okay. And it was the extreme because one of the things this person said was, in my industry, it doesn't matter how many dead bodies are left along the side of the road, as long as we make our numbers. And I was like, this is great. I mean, that's not great, but it's great in the sense that if love can exist here, really it's like the extreme case, the proof of concept that maybe we need to really demonstrate why this matters, when it matters, but also how it might look a little different. So what we discovered is that we had to really kind of ask ourselves, well, it's not consistent. So the short story is it wasn't all over this large global organization. So then the question was, well, is it worse if it's not there at all? Or is it worse when it's unequal? And there are actually arguments for both. So this is ongoing work that my collaborator Yoon-Jin Choi and I are writing up now. So some might say, well, lack of love is worse than if it's unequal. That's bad. But some people say, no, unequal is worse, because then you have, the situation where you see those people over there that are really close, but you're not a part of it. So it's sort of like, cliques, some might say, and you feel excluded. So fortunately, we were able to collect both qualitative interview observational data, also a culture survey. And I have to tell you, for all of you scholars out there, nobody does surveys better than engineers, because let me tell you, they had thoughts. They wanted to share, what they could have done better with the software, with the questions. This organization was so committed to this. They actually had full-time translators in all of the firm's global sites to make sure that people understood all parts of the survey, including the emotions, which one of the things I discovered sort of the painful way is that emotions are so new to a lot of employees that if you give them an emotion survey, they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know what all these emotions mean. So, we learned some things methodologically about how to best help make sure everyone understands what it is we're even talking about. In the interviews we discovered, lo and behold, some of the same metaphors of culture of love that I see in every industry. The family metaphor, we're like brothers and sisters. We fight, but we have a camaraderie. We come together. We pull together during the hard times. So at least initially in those interviews, I thought, all right, it exists somewhere. But I also saw something that I hadn't seen before, which was what happens when it's not equally shared. And this was a very fast-paced, high-pressure, hierarchical, status-oriented organization. So people were complaining. They said, "Oh, well, the band's back together." These were people who had worked together at another semiconductor firm and got together again, and there was a love fest going on with them, and people resented it. They said, "Yeah, well, it was awesome when they were together, and now they all think they're freaking Jesus." And so there was resentment, and there were in-group, out-group dynamics because the love was not equally shared throughout the organization. And worse still, it was particularly strong among the top management. So people felt like not only were these people close and we're not close, but also they happen to be the top management. And then people saw it even at the lower levels. They said, on Glassdoor, which, by the way, is increasingly being used by organizational scholars to measure culture, they were saying it's called the White Boys Club. This person, who was a person of color, didn't feel that way. He said it was the former Big Chip Club because they'd all worked at a large semiconductor firm together. It was like the club of people who used to work there. And he was talking about how demoralizing it was to see that. So we did do a survey where I fully expected to see in the survey what I'd seen in the interviews, which is that unequal love was really not really working the same way it did in the cultures I'd studied, where love was consistently strong. A little bit about methods. I had to do it rather cleverly because one of the things about culture surveys is they're really tricky to fill out when people are so used to writing what they think management wants them to hear. So we did a semi-ideographic approach. Again, they gave me an hour to do the survey with all these staff. So I had them do the current culture and the needed culture so we could disentangle what they thought needed to happen or what they aspired or desired versus what actually was. What we found is that love was one of the strongest emotions that was being expressed, very characteristic, not surprisingly behind curiosity, which you would hope to see in a highly R&D, engineer, innovation motivated company. But interestingly, what we found was variation between teams and within teams. So some teams seem to have inconsistent relationships within the team, and that's where we saw the strongest voluntary turnover. As you can imagine, it's a very competitive industry, so turnover was extremely high, and this was over time. So turnover was highest not where there was no love, but when there was inconsistent love. And we demonstrated that through the turnover patterns. What's so interesting is it wasn't the people who were being excluded from the love who were the ones leaving necessarily. It was also the people who were part of it. In other words, people in general don't like being in situations, in organizational environments where it's inconsistent. So it feels bad if you see people who are left out or if you see people feeling resentful. Unequal amounts of companionate love was impacting both people, both sets of people. And we saw that in voluntary turnover. Okay, so a couple takeaways, and then I'll just leave you with a couple next steps. Workplace relationships can be close enough to be called love. Science proves it. Love does impact the bottom line, no matter how you define it. Although, again, I think there are some areas like directly patient health. Are we changing the ROI of a company directly? That's going to take some intermediary mechanisms. But also, share the love. So when it's seen as more exclusionary or some people don't have access to it, it doesn't tend to have as strong and can actually have backfire and have negative effects. Where are we going? What's happening now? Increasingly, like I said, a lot of culture scholars are starting to look into emotion analysis software, but even honestly, just big data analysis. So natural language processing, large language models of all sorts of data that come from companies. It could be emails, back in the 90s, could be instant messaging, any corpus of archival data. Slack messages, for example, is where I think a lot of culture is taking place. Now it's being analyzed. That also includes Glassdoor. Like I said, a lot of studies on Glassdoor, where if you haven't checked out your company, your employees are in there. And Glassdoor is cool because it gets around the selection bias because employees have to actually give a rating before they can read. So it gets around for the professors in the room, that I call it rate my professor, where all the students go and complain about us. Glassdoor doesn't allow for that quite as much. biometric data. So some emotion scientists are actually working with corporations to sort of measure emotional response rates, heart rates. This is a thriving industry, not surprisingly. I'm a little cautious about it because sometimes, if your heart's racing, is it because you are anxious, or is it because you're romantically interested? Sometimes it's really hard to tell. And lastly, emotion recognition software and hardware to really scale some of what those of us who work on the more kind of anthropology, sociology side can do, especially in larger companies, globally distributed. Um, we're also starting to look into companies that are a little more complex. So what happens in industries like semiconductors where there's a lot of merger and acquisition activity that means you have hybrid cultures. So turns out apple trees, I learned from one of my executive participants, apple trees can have two varieties of apples. So maybe we need to think about culture in terms of having, different kind of cultures within, how do they blend together? I also heard someone use the metaphor of a traditional practice of repairing pottery in Japan, where you take some of the broken pieces, some of the pain, or some of the different types of organizations, and there's this metaphor of the gold that glues them together, so that part of our strength is in looking at organizations in this more complex way. So I'll stop there and take time for questions and just give a big thank you to you all, but also to my collaborators over the years. It is those of you who do the scholarly work know it's very painstaking work to try to work with organizations who are willing to tolerate all that we have to do as scientists to get the work done, to get the science out into the world. So a big thank you to them and to all of you. So I'll stop sharing, and I haven't been monitoring the chat, so hopefully there were some questions coming in and some good things for us to discuss.
Thank you so much, Mandy. There was so much in there to
No,
discuss.
sorry it was so fast
Oh,
too.
it was very clear and very interesting. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure we will have many questions coming from the audience. I'd like to open it up to anybody who would like to ask Mandy questions. Michael, you want to start us?
Abuse the privilege. No, thank you, Manny. This is great. This is fantastic. I think it opens up a lot of questions. My first curiosity was more about the temporal aspect. What you can say about the temporal aspect. I think it may be like if you had sort of loving, affectionate relationships and then that shifts for whatever sort of impact from the outside, especially with the turnover. I'm not even saying that for any particular industry should be different. I think this could be just sort of like, oh, okay, we are not moving from indifference to affection, which probably has all the positive, but there must be impacts that we see in the survivor syndrome or in other kind of things where it's like, there's something happening. It could be as simple as like somebody's withholding communication, but it could also be a shock from the outside where now the organization is reacting and it's turning from okay, loving, abundance-oriented, co-creative to all of a sudden fear and freeze and everything is sort of shifting. And you know better than most that those emotions are more powerful oftentimes and maybe can destroy very quickly the culture. So I'm just curious what you found. You say it's sort of less love in what is it like not
Unequal?
consistent, unequal,
Yeah.
right? But I think that in
So
that temporal piece.
such great questions. I think there were actually like five in there. So on the question of turnover, one of the really interesting pieces of the semiconductor data was a phenomenon that I hadn't seen before, but I have since heard of, called turnover contagion, where people were saying when the group was really close, if one person left, like let's say one friend got fired, they would leave too, meaning their closeness to each other in some cases was stronger to the company. And I think that's something that organizations need to worry about a lot, especially now with so many people working remotely. And some of the things I hear from my MBA students are shocking. They say, for example, my loyalty goes no further than the laptop I'm assigned for when I work from home. And so I think that organizations really do need to worry about this. And what it suggests too is that in some cases it might be too close. So close that your relationships are sort of stronger than your obligation to the organization and its mission, which is also kind of a challenge. We also saw, for example, not so much in any organization that I personally study, but there's a fabulous study by Lily Christina and Mike Pratt on Lehman Brothers breaking up, where it's a study of mourning. And what we are starting to see now, and I have some very, very recent work on grief, which again, it's very ironic that Sigal and I did not have grief in our initial models of organizational culture because, as some of you know, Sigal passed away of glioblastoma 3 years ago, and it was devastating. And the irony was not lost on me that at the time we began this work in the early 2000s, that was so far from our mind. I mean, the grief was the farthest thing we could have imagined, and we didn't actually conceptualize it. And now, to your point, there's starting to be an emergence of research on grief, which includes, as you said, survivor bias, when the organization dies, or when someone does die. So that grief and love, I mean, some people who study grief say that grief is an expression of love. So I think that those questions have brought on additional questions which prompt new research, and it really, really does matter. I think that was the majority of your questions, but meaning like it is a concern, and it does suggest, by the way, I'll say, some of the naysayers who, I will say for the most part come from Scandinavia and Germany. Michael, I will say, I know I think you're German. They tend to, over the years, have been some of the strongest critics of this work. So when I present to international audiences, they will say, I don't think this is appropriate. It's very sort of Weberian in a way, that professional neutrality is the way to go. And that any of this love, as I'm describing it, is problematic because it leads to favoritism, because it leads to, the examples you brought up. And so they, for many years, have been saying, let's scrap it. Let's just keep it professional. So I think some of the international, I will say, for those of you, I saw at least one person from one of my favorite, most wonderful places I've done field work, Mexico. I think there's someone from Tec de Monterrey. And I will say that when I present this work in Latin America and South America, usually what happens is people will come up and say, well, we don't have problems with too little love. We have problems with too much love. Namely, people are uncomfortable having the tough conversations. They don't want to say anything to hurt people's feelings. So it results in a lot of like back channel kind of, conflict avoidance, gossip, having a reluctance to do the hard thing, like when it comes to firing people or disciplining them. So I think the national culture variation is one of the most exciting new directions too. Victoria, I saw your hand pop up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm actually from Mexico, and so I was actually thinking about how cultural differences will affect this, by what you were saying, but also for the language. Like in English, you only have the word love, but we have in Spanish amor, cariño, aprecio, afecto. So many, many different words that describe like the range of feelings or behaviors that we could consider for this, right? And so, yes, I totally agree with you that cultural differences will have a very big impact in what companies consider to be appropriate or to be a loving or a caring environment. But it becomes more complex in a globalized world where we have to take care of different people from different cultures and different countries working together. So I think that's a big challenge for multinational companies to set like the minimum of caring and providing a loving environment that will make sense for most people in the company.
Yes, and thank you for the comment. So it was you I saw from Tec de Monterrey. Yeah, I did my field work in Querétaro, so central Mexico. And what I discovered, especially in Mexico, was that it's not only always just love, but also what other emotions are in the culture. So in Mexico, for example, the emotion that I wrote up in a separate paper was joviality, especially the humor, the double entendres, and that was a form of caring. I mean, like teasing, for example, in Mexico is very different from in the US. And I think like HR systems in Mexico are perfectly fine with people, joking in the way they do in Mexico. But in the US, like you would be sent to HR for, making a comment about someone's like physical appearance. Whereas, that was a sort of affection, like, chaparrito or, gordita, like it's not a big deal. But in the US, it's like, oh yeah, no, that's body shaming. That's, so absolutely. And the great thing about taking a more anthropological perspective on this is that the words, to your question about language, the words are one part of it, which are an important part. And we do know, for example, that emotions are conveyed through language. So, for those of you who are bilingual, you will know that when you switch from one language to another, it does bring up a different system of meaning, of emotionality, which has been documented for many, many years. So the words are one part of it. But then what it also brings up is in a global organization, are we going to try to insist that we are one team around the world when frankly it's not realistic? So to give another example, I did field work in the Philippines, and the Philippines is another amazing culture, a lot of companionate love, and they love Christmas. And so, that part of the company had to allow its employees to do like an entire month of Christmas. Like it had to be, it was so part of the culture. And, some other company, like, or in Asia, for example, like the Lunar New Year, things stop. So I think in the same way that we take into account sort of cultural traditions around holidays, festivals, religious celebrations, I think we can also take into account some of the cultural variation in how love shows up, which include, as the example I gave, affection in Mexico looks a little different from affection in some other cultures. And that's okay as long as organizations, and I really want to put the finger on human resources, on HR systems being, thinking more like anthropologists and less like lawyers. I think in the US, we have a very legalistic culture when it comes to HR, especially as some of the funding has been cut. And I don't think that's a great thing, especially for global organizations where, another emotion that I hear a lot of cultural variation on is gratitude. So in the US is very into gratitude. I mean, we have this Thanksgiving holiday that just passed. But that's an emotion where I've talked to people when I've presented that work, and they've said, yeah, gratitude doesn't work in my culture. It sounds like completely fake. No one would believe it. So no gratitude. And I thought, whoa, who could hate gratitude? That's the one. I mean, people want to stay away from love because it's too, creeps some people out. But who doesn't love gratitude? And then sure enough, some cultures said, no, gratitude's out. But I will say HR loves gratitude more, because one of the things we discovered is that people, and we've demonstrated this, people will do things for a thank you. You don't have to pay them $1. If you just show appreciation, they'll do it. And my concern with that is, especially results oriented, bottom line oriented companies can get really unethical with that. They can say, all right, you don't have to pay people. We just say thank you and they'll just do it. I mean, they do want the thank you, but I think it cannot come at the expense of humane working conditions and fair treatment and fair pay. So with all of these emotions, there's like a grab bag of sort of second order effects or unintended consequences. But I would say, to the language question, language is an indicator of culture. So if they have 100 words for love, it may mean that there's a more sophisticated lexicon, but it may also show up in just gestures and actions.
I think there's one more hand. Day Jonas. Don't know if I'm saying it right.
Hi. Thank you for your time today very much. And I would like to ask a question really in line with what we're talking about now. And I work for an organization that has primarily been located in North America, throughout the US, Mexico, and Canada. And now we are extending into different areas of Asia and Europe. So we have a primary culture of taking care of each other. So that looks very employee centric. We do employee surveys. We really want to understand how their perspectives are formed around the work that we're doing. And then we use their perspectives to help drive our continuous improvement, both in terms of process and leadership. But my question lies is, as we continue to grow into this more of a global landscape, there can be exceptions, right, that we take for these cultural differences, but how do you start? Where is the line where you say, nope, this is something that we're going to come across the board with in terms of really like people and interaction versus, it's okay to have this variation here?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So one idea that I've seen be quite successful is when it's, for example, a global organization, or even if it just has sites in some other countries, not everybody, but a lot of people in these organizations really like celebrating other things too. So they would it's almost like a form of cross-cultural exchange where they would say, like, for example, the CEO of the semiconductor company loved going to the Philippines site during Christmas time because it was amazing. They put on like a Broadway level show. They really got into it. So that was a practice that was sort of beloved at the company, and everybody would want to take part of it. So I think it's also an opportunity to kind of share traditions that aren't exclusionary. So, well, and by the way, I think the great thing about love, so I've heard at this point, I think almost every concern about love, one of which is, I'm not comfortable sharing my culture at work. So it's a stigmatized identity, and I'm not comfortable sharing it. And that could be religious, it could be cultural, it could be, gender identity, whatever. And what's interesting about love is that in strong cultures of love, when they're working optimally, let's say, that about a person, and you don't force them to disclose more than they're comfortable with. So like, let's say for example, some companies, especially in the US, like to do this whole after hours socializing and, get to know you stuff. And people say, well, I don't drink alcohol, so I don't feel, I don't feel comfortable with that. In a strong culture of love, you would recognize each other's needs, each other's individual differences, and accommodate for it. So you wouldn't actually be forcing it on someone, because in the same way, when I gave the example about humor, like, that this is a sensitive topic for someone because you know them better, so you don't go there. So love actually, again, when it's done at its best, it allows for you to introduce some practices that sort of, might be not, your custom, but what a great custom it is. I'm not saying everybody needs to do a Broadway level theater for Christmas, but, for example, one of the examples from China that I love is during the Lunar New Year, they have this moon cake that's circulated. And so someone gave me an example of, he knew that his wife, because the work hours in China were really extreme. So the person was working very long hours at this company, and he knew that his coworker's wife was like really getting mad about it. It was causing some family problems. So he used this workplace gift. Essentially, they would give out Lunar New Year gifts to the employees. Went to the employee's house as his friend, as an opportunity to sort of talk to the wife, not explicitly, because it was done very sort of subtly and not directly, like indirectly, but to sort of explain like how important the work was he was doing, and to sort of like try to help his friend's family life in a way that was, sort of unique to the culture. But I also thought, like, what a great way for them to take something that was very customary, for people to be involved in each other's family lives, like the Philippines was the same, and maybe we could do a little bit more of that, where if you have an opportunity to sort of recognize that we are not just people in organizations without lives outside, maybe the US could do a little bit more of that, where in some sectors there is this sort of segmentation. So, that's an idea where he was actually expressing companionate love by trying to sort of work outside the system in a more indirect way, and again, that's an example that's very cultural, but also I think is a way that they, took their culture of companionate love and adapted it that could maybe help out other places too. So I know that's a very roundabout way of answering your question, but I think, seeing some of these examples work in practice, and you said you're surveying people. So if you surveyed people, you could say, what is a cherished tradition in your village or in your city or in your country that we could maybe, have to recognize, your culture. For example, I mean, I think that's one way you could just add that. And I will say, for anyone who does survey work, adding an open-ended box question to any survey will save you. We found that out in the example. Someone asked about anxiety and how that was one of Michael's questions. So we actually found that in cultures of anxiety, love was a buffer. So anxiety in the extreme is not great, but love helped it. And in particular, because it was people, it's really stressful. It's really, and this was a city that had just undergone a natural disaster. So like the whole entire city infrastructure was destroyed, but the relationships that the people had with each other were their buffer in those stressful times. So love works even in those situations. But in that instance, we weren't expecting so much anxiety. In retrospect, that was crazy because they had just undergone a natural disaster. But we were like, what are they anxious about? There's so many choices. This hospital system had just been taken over by a private equity firm. So that was not great for that. I mean, there's so many reasons they could have been anxious. So we had an open-ended question where we said, anything else you want to tell us? And over those thousands of employees, we got so much rich descriptive information that it saved us when we were then trying to kind of fill in the blanks where the survey, we couldn't have anticipated some things, but we really were very helped out by that open-ended box. So just letting employees say whatever they're going to say and then analyzing that qualitative data. And frankly, with these new AI agents, even if you don't have time, like those of us who do qualitative work know it takes forever to do it, properly. Frankly, if you're short on time and you're a corporation, with the right privacy settings and whatnot, you could really get a good summary of what's going on very quickly without having to go through the journal review process that challenges that sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good luck.
Mandy. I want to also just chime in and ask a question about, like, a few things are kind of in my mind. Well, the biggest question is, do you have any insights into how people cultivate love? Any kind of ideas for interventions, or what could make them care, especially in an organizational setting? Yeah, let me leave at that. I also have other thoughts, but
I love that question so much because, of course, after a decade of documenting, and immediately my mind started to go toward what are interventions that we could do. And so this gets also to Michael's question about temporal. So one of the challenges about love is it is not something that, I mean, Barbara Fredrickson has done some just amazing work on micro moments of love. And I think that's important to think about because you can create micro moments, the positive organizational scholarship community would call it sort of a high quality connection. That can happen very rapidly in seconds, in minutes. But to get the kind of closeness and the relationship benefits of love, it does take some more time. Doesn't have to be years. It could be, for example, I am a big fan of long bus rides and offsites. So I teach an MBA class where we take these students around the world. And I can tell you that in 5 days, I have been closer to some of these people than to family members I've had for decades. So it doesn't necessarily have to take years, but it often does take a sort of immersive experience of kind of getting to know someone. It's usually involving getting to know somebody. So one of the micro interventions I've done is a sort of getting to know you exercise, and that's structured. There's fabulous work being done by a scholar, Guy, I'm going to mispronounce his last name, Ixitov. He's presented here in the past. He's in Israel, and he's done really incredible intervention work on listening, because listening, not surprisingly, is an important, I'd say, subcomponent or practice or behavior that does contribute to feelings of trust and closeness. So at this point, we've started with some micro interventions. I think it's going to take a very special organization to invite us in to do a full culture of love intervention. But we've started to piece together some of the building blocks of like a training program, for example. But I think that with culture, an important caveat is that it's not typically a fast thing. So if my one complaint about organizations can be, it's that a lot of times it takes longer than some people are willing to invest. And so sometimes they will cut off an intervention before you can really start to see the effects. And to Michael's other point, it is also the case that you could establish a culture of love, or you could have a culture of love, and then something extremely painful happens, a rupture. And I think that those ruptures, in the same way that trust takes a long time to build and is easily broken, I think what we're starting to see is that ruptures is one of the next areas where we really need to look at, and maybe interventions for when there is a rupture. So to answer your question, we're going there. We have one paper that is an intervention study under review. It's been a process in the scientific world, so stay tuned. But I do think that we're at least getting some micro practices and micro interventions that seem to be quite effective.
That's great news for everyone. Thank you so much, Mandy. We are by the hour, so it's time to say goodbye, sadly. We really appreciate all the wisdom that you shared with us today, and to everyone in the audience for your comments, questions on the chat as well. Wishing everyone a wonderful year, end of semester, and holiday break. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Please stay in touch.